The Maybach engine gave 3 sharp coughs before falling into silence. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper brought his fist down hard against the turret hatch, the dull thud echoing across the frozen Belgian landscape. Dawn was breaking over Hansfeld on December 17th, 1944, and the most powerful armored spearhead Nazi Germany had assembled for Operation Watch on Rhine sat motionless in the pre-dawn darkness. Below him, Unterscharfer Klaus Meyer called up from the driver's compartment, his voice strained with barely suppressed fear. The reserve tanks are bone dry, her Obersturmbannführer. Peiper descended from his command vehicle, his boots breaking through the thin crust of ice that covered the Belgian soil. All around him stretched the pride of the Waffen SS, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and close to 5,000 Germany's most battle-hardened soldiers, every vehicle frozen in place by empty fuel tanks. Through the lifting fog, Peiper could make out the abandoned American installations ahead, fire still crackling in oil drums, steam rising from abandoned coffee mugs, and there, arranged in perfect rows like some divine offering, stood thousands upon thousands of jerry cans, their olive drab surfaces dull in the gray morning light. Peiper moved forward slowly, each step deliberate. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Martin Fischer, forced open one of the containers and inhaled deeply. High-octane gasoline, her Obersturmbannführer, American fuel, as his men began the desperate work of refueling their vehicles. Peiper walked through the depot, counting, calculating. 50,000 gallons. Enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe to the Meuse River. Enough to potentially salvage the entire offensive. The Americans had abandoned more petroleum in this single forward depot than most German divisions had received in half a year. But as Peiper stood among this unexpected bounty, watching his exhausted men pour American fuel into German tanks, a terrible understanding settled over him like the morning mist. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities without apparent concern, if they could leave behind what Germany would defend with entire divisions, then this war had already reached its conclusion. Germany had not simply miscalculated the strength of its enemies. Germany had fundamentally failed to comprehend the nature of the opponent it faced. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have immediately ended all discussion of offensive operations. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the absolute lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns. The Luno Works, which had manufactured 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed barely 5,000 tons by September. The Buna hydrogenation plant at Politz, Blechhammer, and Brucks were operating at less than 10% of capacity. The numbers told an undeniable story of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian fields, managed 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American production. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics, while America was drowning its armies in petroleum abundance. Major Friedrich Simon of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half was actually delivered due to transportation difficulties and Allied air attacks. The German High Command was betting the entire offensive on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy that revealed terminal weakness rather than operational flexibility. The Americans, meanwhile, had constructed a petroleum pipeline system across France called Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, and the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily to front lines. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving 1.4 million gallons. They were accumulating reserves while actively fighting. Joachim Peiper was nobody's fool. At 29 years old, he stood as one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had learned through bitter experience that in modern warfare, fuel was more precious than ammunition itself. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the operation commenced, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, spoke with brutal frankness. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies along the way. The fuel allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper totaled 31,000 gallons, sufficient for approximately 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse measured 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were built into the operational plan from its very conception. As his column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict conservation orders. Tanks would operate in single file to minimize fuel consumption. Engines would be shut down during any halt exceeding 5 minutes. The capture of American fuel dumps was designated Priority 1, superseding even tactical objectives. The contrast with American operations could not have been more stark. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, recorded in his unit diary that they had received their third fuel resupply of the week, 8,000 gallons, while their storage tanks were already at full capacity. December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. The German artillery barrage at Open Operation Watch on Rhine consumed more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. But even this impressive display masked critical shortages that would soon prove fatal. Peiper's column began moving at 7 in the morning, already behind schedule, due to traffic congestion. The roads, which appeared as highways on German maps, revealed themselves as narrow country lanes, many unpaved and unsuited for heavy armor. Within hours, massive traffic jams developed as vehicles designed for the open terrain of the Russian steppes struggled through the dense Ardennes forest. At Lanzerath, Peiper's first objective, they encountered unexpected resistance from a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men who held up the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours through a combination of determination and tactical skill. During this extended delay, Peiper's vehicles sat with engines idling, burning precious fuel while accomplishing nothing. When they finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of their total fuel allocation. At this consumption rate, they would run completely dry before reaching even the halfway point to the Meuse. The American supply depot at Hansfeld was not even classified as a primary facility. It served as a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, what the U.S. Army designated as a Class 3B depot, essentially a temporary refueling station. Yet, what Peiper discovered there exceeded the entire monthly fuel allocation for a German panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Martin Fischer would later testify that they found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline, stacked 3 meters high and extending for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them before withdrawing. The captured fuel consisted of high-octane aviation, gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the temperamental Maybach engines installed in Tiger tanks, had been designed for 74-octane fuel. The American gasoline proved almost too refined, causing engine problems in several German vehicles not designed to handle such high-quality petroleum. As Peiper's men frantically refueled their vehicles, they made additional discoveries that proved even more disturbing. Sergeant Ernst Weber found shipping manifests in the depot office. Having worked in his father's import business before the war, he could read English fluently. The documents indicated this fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, transported across the Atlantic to Liverpool, ferried across the English Channel to Normandy, and trucked 400 miles to Hansfeld. The entire journey of over 6,000 miles had required less than 6 weeks. Weber showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper, who read them twice before crumpling them in his fist. He said nothing, but his face went pale. Both men understood instantly what these logistics manifests revealed about the true nature of their enemy. Private Carl Brenner discovered a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would consume in the entire offensive. To properly comprehend the shock of Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld, one must understand Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied strategic bombing had reduced German synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft squadrons for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training programs had been cut from 250 flight hours to 60 hours, producing dangerously inexperienced flyers. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased all major operations. U-boats were fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel fuel by running on battery power for longer periods. On the home front, German civilians had not witnessed private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual liters. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows for lack of fuel. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's entire oil supply. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were operating at such excess capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they possessed surplus crude oil with no immediate military application. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld, Peiper's column surged forward with renewed hope. They reached Bulge by noon on December 17th, capturing additional supplies including rations, ammunition, and most importantly, detailed maps showing locations of other American fuel depots in the operational area. But these maps revealed a deeply disturbing truth to anyone capable of reading between the lines. The Americans maintained fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads featured a depot. The U.S. First Army alone held 3.5 million gallons in strategic reserve, more than the entire fuel allocation for the German Ardennes offensive. Peiper pushed aggressively onward to Lignaville, where his forces would commit what became known as the Malmedy Massacre, executing 84 American prisoners of war. Even this war crime carried direct connection to fuel desperation. Peiper would later claim in his defense that he could not spare gasoline or vehicles to transport prisoners to the rear, a statement that revealed how completely fuel shortage had compromised German operational flexibility. By evening on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons. Here existed enough fuel to absolutely guarantee reaching the Meuse and possibly beyond. Victory seemed within grasp. But as the first German vehicles approached the depot, American engineers were already executing contingency plans. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach through radio intercepts. His orders from higher headquarters were brutally simple: deny fuel to the enemy at absolutely any cost. The Stavelot depot contained 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline stored in jerry, stacked across 15 acres of Belgian farmland. At 16:30 hours on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard approached within artillery range, Captain Brewster gave the order his men had been dreading. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the massive stacks of jerry cans. White phosphorus grenades were distributed to squad leaders. Technical Sergeant Paul Hinton threw the first grenade into the fuel-soaked ground. The explosion proved immediate and tremendous. He will recall decades later. A wall of flame shot upward, perhaps 100 feet into the darkening sky. Within minutes, the entire depot had transformed into a raging inferno visible for miles. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to witness a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the winter sky. The fire would burn continuously for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back to Germany. Unterscharfer Meyer described the scene in testimony recorded after the war. The Obersturmbannführer stood motionless on his tank turret, watching the flames for perhaps 5 minutes without speaking. Then he climbed down and said quietly, almost to himself, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to deny them to us. What exactly are we doing here?" Across the entire Ardennes battlefield, American engineers were systematically destroying fuel dumps rather than risk their capture by German forces. At Troisponts, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were deliberately destroyed. In total, Americans intentionally eliminated over 8 million gallons during the first week of the offensive, more petroleum than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons of fuel was rooted in a supply system that operated beyond German comprehension. The Red Ball Express had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating around the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily just in the operation of the supply system itself. The logistics operation burned more fuel than German Army Group be received monthly for actual combat operations. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded routes across France and Belgium. The system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of petroleum products. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded in his daily log for December 18th that fuel receipts the previous day totaled 1,847,000 gallons, while fuel issued to units reached 1,623,000 gallons, producing a net gain to reserves of 224,000 gallons. The Americans were actively building their fuel reserves during major offensive operations. The pipeline system proved even more impressive from an engineering perspective. Operation Pluto had successfully laid pipelines across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain to the continent. An extensive network of pipelines extended steadily inland behind advancing Allied forces. The Cherbourg to Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine pipeline moved 650,000 gallons. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily, while receiving 8.2 million gallons. They were building massive strategic reserves during active combat operations, a logistical achievement that would have been considered impossible by German operational planners. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossible mathematics of the German position became increasingly clear to everyone involved. At Chenus, they captured another small depot containing 5,000 gallons, fuel consumed in just 3 hours of subsequent combat operations. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in battle conditions. Panther tanks burned 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain with constant maneuvering, consumption rates increased by 40%. Hauptmann Heinrich Braun, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded with growing despair that by noon on December 18th, they had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began, while capturing perhaps 55,000 gallons from various American depots. They were operating at an unsustainable deficit that could only end one way. The Americans monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intelligence intercepts understood Peiper's fuel situation with remarkable precision. General Courtney Hodges issued orders to all American units in the sector. Enemy forces are critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by potential capture. That same day, American C-47 transport aircraft flew 316 sorties delivering supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel delivered by parachute. The Americans were flying more fuel to a single surrounded garrison than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed for offensive operations. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged determined defenders at Stillmont, the fuel crisis had become absolutely critical and undeniable. Tanks were being deliberately abandoned due to empty fuel tanks rather than from battle damage or mechanical failure. Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel reserves, perhaps 8,000 gallons total, sufficient for one final engagement or a fighting retreat to German lines, but definitely not both. Meanwhile, Allied operational planners were already preparing detailed logistics for January offensive operations. Brigadier General Morris Gillen formally requested 245 million gallons for Allied operations in the coming month. The request was approved without significant discussion or concern about availability. The contrast between German and American logistics extended far beyond simple quantity. American vehicles have been deliberately standardized for maintenance efficiency and fuel economy. Sherman tanks consume 0.8 gallons per mile, compared to Tiger's 2.5 gallons per mile. American trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon when fully loaded with supplies. Parts proved universally interchangeable across vehicle types. Maintenance procedures were simplified and standardized. German forces, by contrast, operated a bewildering array of captured and domestically manufactured vehicles with radically different fuel requirements and maintenance needs. French tanks required different oil specifications than German Panthers. Soviet trucks captured on the Eastern Front needed different replacement parts than German Opels. Each complication multiplied logistical difficulties exponentially. On December 20th, Peiper received a devastating radio message from division headquarters. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible at this time. Continue mission with available resources. Peiper summoned his remaining commanders for a brutally honest assessment. Sturmbannführer Werner Pochk spoke what everyone already understood. We have fuel remaining for perhaps 20 kilometers of movement. The Meuse River lies 30 kilometers ahead. According to Hauptsturmführer's testimony recorded years later, the Obersturmbannführer stated plainly that they had discovered they were fighting an enemy who burned more fuel to deny it to German forces than Germany had received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed absolutely miraculous at the time, meant nothing whatsoever to them. We cannot win this war. This terrible realization was spreading rapidly throughout German forces engaged in the Ardennes. General Otto von Manschufel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, would later write in his memoirs that when he learned Americans had deliberately destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk German capture, he understood the offensive had failed before it truly began. The industrial capacity gap was simply too vast to overcome through tactical skill or operational cleverness. Colonel Friedrich von Donder, captured on December 23rd, told his American interrogators something that shocked them with its frank honesty. Your soldiers casually throw away chocolate bars. My men have not seen real chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons of fuel without apparent concern. We measure our fuel supplies by the individual leader. How can any army fight against such overwhelming abundance? By December 21st, Peiper found himself completely surrounded at La Gleize, his tanks immobile and useless. The American forces encircling his position, including elements of the 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne Division, and 3rd Armored Division, possessed a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper's entire force possessed perhaps 1,000 gallons remaining. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home to his family in Ohio, describing the absurd situation. We have Germans completely surrounded who literally ran out of gas like some tourist on a Sunday drive. Our company commander jokes that we use more fuel heating coffee water than they have remaining for their tanks. The American response to the Ardennes offensive demonstrated industrial warfare operating at peak efficiency and coordination. Patton's Third Army pivot northward to relieve Bastogne required 350,000 gallons just for the redeployment movement itself. Considered logistically impossible by German operational standards, yet accomplished smoothly within 3 days. December 23rd brought clear weather conditions across the Ardennes. Allied aircraft flew over 2,000 sorties that single day, each one burning fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. 47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour of flight operations. 26 Marauder medium bombers burned 200 gallons hourly. One day's air operations consumed more petroleum than Germany's entire Ardennes offensive allocation. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper made the agonizing decision to abandon all vehicles and attempt escape on foot through American lines. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the offensive with such high hopes just 1 week earlier, 39 remained technically operational but completely immobilized by lack of fuel. These were systematically destroyed using remaining ammunition to prevent capture. Obersturmbannführer Heinz Grolmus described the heartbreaking scene. We drained the last fuel from all remaining vehicles, perhaps 200 gallons total from nearly 40 vehicles. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank using a Panzerfaust. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment destroyed entirely by empty fuel tanks, not enemy action. Of the 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 returned to German lines on foot, abandoning everything. They had advanced 60 miles into Belgium. captured several supply depots, and discovered the fundamental truth about Allied logistics that would determine the war's outcome. News of Peiper's discoveries and the fuel crisis spread rapidly through German command structures. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received comprehensive reports on captured American supplies and the quantities the Americans had deliberately destroyed. His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction for the historical record. The field marshal read the supply quantities twice, as if unable to believe the numbers. 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed across the entire offensive rather than risk our capture. He stated quietly that we are clearly not fighting the same war as our enemies. When Hitler was informed on December 28th, he refused to accept the reality these numbers represented. Speer wrote in his diary that Hitler insisted the quantities must be propaganda fabrications designed to damage German morale. When shown aerial photographs of the burning Stavelot depot, Hitler claimed they were Hollywood special effects, propaganda films designed to discourage German forces. But lower-ranking officers and enlisted men who had witnessed the fuel abundance firsthand understood the truth. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, carefully wording his letter to pass German censorship. The Americans destroy more fuel in a single day than we receive in a month of allocation. They drive tanks as casually as we march on foot. This war is already lost. The fuel crisis represented merely the most visible symptom of a much larger truth about industrial capacity. By 1944, the United States produced 50% of total world manufacturing output. American factories were completing a new aircraft every 5 minutes, launching a new ship every single day, rolling out a new tank every 7 minutes. The petroleum production statistics were simply overwhelming when examined honestly. United States production reached 1.8 billion barrels annually. Soviet Union production totaled 110 million barrels. Germany, including all synthetic production facilities, managed 33 million barrels. Japan produced just 2.6 million barrels. The Axis powers combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum output. Every major German offensive operation after 1942 had been fundamentally constrained by fuel shortages. Every American offensive operation was supported by such abundance that German operational planners literally could not conceive of such logistics. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a revealing incident in his diary for December 27th. A logistics officer reported with apparent concern that poor weather conditions had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily, well below normal rates. There was momentary concern until someone noted that this reduced delivery rate still exceeded Germany's total fuel allocation for the entire Ardennes offensive. German prisoners of war captured during the Ardennes fighting proved far more shocked by American logistical abundance and casual waste than by American firepower or tactical skill. Seeing American GIs carelessly discard half-eaten rations or use gasoline for heating water shattered morale more effectively than artillery bombardment. Oberst Gustav Reichhelm told his interrogators something that American intelligence found deeply significant. We understood your production statistics in an abstract sense, as numbers on paper. But actually seeing American soldiers waste more supplies than we possess made those statistics suddenly real and overwhelming. Every German soldier who witnessed your casual abundance understood immediately that this war was already hopeless. This knowledge spread through letters home despite German military censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Muller wrote to his family, Americans wash vehicle parts in pure gasoline as if it were water. They feed chocolate to their dogs. They fire artillery barges for Christmas celebrations. We cannot fight against infinity itself. The psychological impact undermined German racial superiority narratives that had formed the ideological foundation of the Nazi state. How could the supposedly decadent Americans possess such overwhelming wealth and industrial capacity, while the master race scraped desperately for basic necessities? During the Nuremberg trials, German military leaders consistently cited logistics shortages, particularly fuel, as the ultimately decisive factor in Germany's defeat. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified under oath that Germany possessed operational superiority from 1940 to 1941, but by 1944 could not effectively move forces due to fuel shortages, while Americans moved entire armies around like chess pieces on a board. Peiper himself, tried for the Malmedy massacre, offered revealing testimony about how fuel calculations influenced every single decision after December 17th. Every tactical choice, every decision about whether to pursue retreating enemies or conserve fuel for continued advance was fundamentally determined by fuel shortage. We could not maneuver freely or pursue defeated enemies effectively. The Americans moved with complete freedom while we counted every leader. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German blitzkrieg doctrine, wrote in his post-war memoirs that when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, an amount that meant everything to desperate German forces, but absolutely nothing to American logistics, the war was effectively over. The story resonates powerfully because it represents the moment when romantic notions of warfare died forever in the cold mathematics of industrial production. Modern wars between industrial powers will be decided by factory output and resource availability, not by warrior courage or tactical brilliance. Dr. Richard Overy, the distinguished British historian, calculated that by 1944 Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-to-1 in virtually every major military category. In petroleum production specifically, the ratio approached 50-to-1. These overwhelming advantages simply could not be overcome through superior training, better tactics, or individual courage. America produced 324,750 aircraft during the entire war. Germany manufactured 119,970. Americans built 88,410 tanks. Germany produced 46,857. But most tellingly from a strategic perspective, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany desperately scraped together 33 million barrels from all sources combined. December 24th, 1944. As Peiper's surviving men slipped through American lines on foot during the night, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the full magnitude of their discovery crystallized with brutal clarity. They had captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, an amount that seemed absolutely miraculous at the time, only to learn within hours that this represented a meaningless quantity to an enemy who could casually burn millions. Unterscharfer Meyer reflected in a 1975 interview. That morning at Hansfeld, discovering American fuel, we celebrated as if we had won the lottery itself. By evening, after learning about the deliberate burning at Stavelot, we understood with absolute certainty that we had already lost everything. The Americans possessed so much that they could deliberately destroy what we would literally die to possess. The 50,000 gallons represented less than what a single American armored division consumed in 2 days of normal operations, less than what the Red Ball Express supply trucks burned in 3 hours of routine deliveries, a rounding error in Allied daily consumption statistics. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote in his memoirs that German desperate attempts to capture fuel supplies revealed their fundamental miscalculation about American logistics. They assumed we valued fuel supplies as they did, as essentially irreplaceable strategic assets. They could not conceive that we possessed such abundance that we could burn millions of gallons rather than accept even minor tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on Rhine ultimately failed through the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons total, with 40% coming from captured American supplies rather than German logistics. The difference had to be made up through battlefield captures. During the same time period, American forces consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more petroleum than German forces. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, 800 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and 1,000 aircraft shot down or lost operational causes. But the most devastating loss proved to be the final destruction of illusions about Germany's capacity to continue the war. Every German soldier who witnessed American material abundance during the Ardennes fighting understood with absolute certainty that Germany was not fighting a war anymore, but simply participating in its own prolonged execution. Joachim Peiper survived the war, imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes, including the Malmedy massacre. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his home in France by unknown assailants, likely former resistance members. But in a 1967 interview with historian Henry Lehman, he spoke with remarkable honesty about that morning at Hansfeld. Finding that fuel depot proved to be the worst possible thing that could have happened to us. If we had simply run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with some measure of dignity intact. Instead, we discovered that Americans possessed oceans of fuel, while we desperately counted individual drops. We discovered the absolute impossibility of our situation. The lesson extends far beyond World War II and the Ardennes offensive. In industrial warfare between modern powers, logistics capacity supersedes tactical brilliance every time. Industrial production overwhelms individual courage and dedication. Material abundance defeats determination and fighting spirit. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained, more experienced in combat, and more tactically skilled on an individual level than his American counterpart. None of that mattered in the slightest. The Americans were supported by an industrial machine operating at such capacity that it could waste more resources than Germany could produce at peak efficiency. This fundamental truth was encoded in every jerrycan at Hansfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline laid across France, every truck in the Red Ball Express. Wars between industrial powers would be decided in factories and refineries and shipyards, not by brilliant generals conducting clever operations. Colonel Trevor Dupuy, the distinguished military analyst, calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies delivered daily to the front lines. Each German soldier received 3 pounds. Americans complained constantly about waste and inefficiency in their supply system. Germans would have considered American waste to represent unimaginable abundance beyond their wildest dreams. In 1984, 40 years after battle, veterans from both sides gathered at La Gleize in Belgium for a commemoration ceremony. The local museum displays Peiper's Tiger tank, still positioned almost exactly where it was abandoned when fuel ran out on December 23, 1944. Former Underofficer Carl Wertmann stood beside the rusted hulk with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division, who had helped capture the position. "We always wonder why you stopped." Advancing, Anderson said honestly, "We thought it must be some kind of tactical decision or strategic pause." Wertmann laughed bitterly at the memory. "We stopped because every single tank was completely empty. You burned millions of gallons just to keep them away from us. How could any army possibly fight against that kind of abundance?" Anderson fell quiet for a moment, then responded with equal honesty. "We never really knew you were that desperately short of fuel. We had so much ourselves that we never thought about it as a potential problem." That brief exchange captured the entire truth of December 1944. One side measured fuel by individual gallons and fought desperately for each jerrycan. The other side measured in millions and burned oceans without apparent concern. The outcome was predetermined by industrial mathematics that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. German military records provide damning evidence of the fuel crisis that doomed the Ardennes offensive from its conception. Army Group B War Diary entries for December 1944 tell the story in stark numbers. December 16th, offensive commences. Fuel supplies at 70% of calculated minimum requirements. December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper captures 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld. December 18th, multiple American depots deliberately destroyed by retreating forces. Estimated 5 million gallons lost to German use. December 19th, fuel situation critical across entire offensive front. Multiple units immobilized. December 24th, Kampfgruppe Peiper abandons all vehicles due to fuel exhaustion. Meanwhile, American First Army daily reports tell a radically different story. December 16th, fuel reserves 3.7 million gallons. December 17th, 2.2 million gallons deliberately destroyed to deny enemy use. December 18th, 1.8 million gallons received from supply pipeline. December 24th, total fuel reserves 4.1 million gallons. The Americans treated millions of gallons with casual indifference, while Germans desperately hoarded individual jerry cans like priceless treasures. Beyond simple quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority that multiplied the advantage. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking processes that produce higher octane gasoline more efficiently than German hydrogenation methods. American 100-octane aviation fuel provided aircraft with significant performance advantages over German planes running 87-octane synthetic fuel. Americans had perfected fuel additives that Germany could not replicate despite pioneering the underlying chemistry. Tetraethyl lead, ethylene dibromide, sophisticated detergent packages. German engines designed for lower quality fuel often ran poorly on captured American gasoline, experiencing detonation and premature wear. The fuel shortage fundamentally shaped every German soldier's experience during the Ardennes offensive. Gefreiter Hans Muller recorded in his diary for December 20th, "March 30 kilometers through snow today. No fuel available for trucks. Past dozens of abandoned American vehicles left running with engines on for cabin heating. They leave engines running to stay warm. We marched through snow until our feet bled. Medical services were crippled by fuel shortage. Ambulances could not evacuate wounded soldiers from frontline positions. Field hospitals could not operate generators for surgical equipment. Men died waiting for transportation that never arrived because no fuel existed." Oberar's Dr. Wilhelm Kesting testified after the war. "We maintained excellent surgeons and adequate medical supplies, many captured from American stocks, but we had no fuel for ambulances or medical vehicles. Wounded men died who could easily have been saved with just 10 kilometers of transportation. The discoveries about American logistics shattered German propaganda narratives about American weakness and decadence. Soldiers have been told repeatedly that Americans were soft, incapable of serious fighting, would collapse under determined German assault. Then they discovered that Americans could deliberately destroy more fuel than Germany possessed for offensive operations." Goebbels' diary entry for December 28th reveals growing concern. Reports indicate serious morale problems among frontline troops. Soldiers writing letters home about overwhelming American material superiority, directly undermining our narrative about enemy weakness. But the stories spread faster than censorship could contain them. The myth of German superiority could not survive direct contact with American industrial logistics. The Ardennes offensive failure meant Germany no longer possessed any options except increasingly desperate defense. General Alfred Jodl testified at Nuremberg. "After the Ardennes operation flamed out, we understood the war was definitively lost. We had played our final card and discovered the enemy held all the aces in the deck." The German fuel crisis became absolute catastrophe after the Ardennes. Recognizing this weakness, Allied air forces focused intensively on destroying remaining fuel production. By February 1945, German synthetic fuel production had ceased entirely. The Luftwaffe was grounded permanently. Pilot training programs were canceled. The Wehrmacht became a static defensive force, destroyed piecemeal by mobile enemies they could not match. Spring 1945 brought surreal scenes across Germany. Entire German units surrendered not from battlefield defeat, but from complete immobility due to fuel exhaustion. General Major Fritz Bayerlein described commanding a panzer division in April 1945. "We maintained 42 fully operational tanks with experienced crews and adequate ammunition supplies. We possess exactly 300 liters of fuel, insufficient to reach the next town. We destroyed our tanks with the last ammunition and walked into captivity." Meanwhile, the American advance was constrained only by traffic jams created by the sheer abundance of vehicles. Patton's Third Army alone operated 15,000 vehicles in April 1945, more vehicles than some entire German army groups. Peiper's fuel crisis demonstrates with brutal clarity how industrial capacity determined World War II's ultimate outcome. When Peiper stood among those captured jerry cans on that frozen December morning, he glimpsed the fundamental truth his nation had tried desperately to deny. Germany was fighting an enemy whose waste exceeded German necessity. The numbers tell the entire story with mathematical precision. German Ardennes offensive total allocation 5 million gallons. Fuel deliberately destroyed by Americans 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption across all fronts 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's miraculous capture at Hansfeld 50,000 gallons. Percentage of American daily supplies 0.6%. A rounding error. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans. It destroyed the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves and accomplished nothing of lasting military value. But its true impact lay in spreading knowledge throughout German ranks that America possessed incomprehensible industrial abundance beyond any possibility of matching or overcoming. Peiper's discovery was not simply about fuel quantities, but about the fundamental nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Ultimate victory belonged to whichever nation could produce the most petroleum, steel, aluminum, and copper. Germany never possessed even a remote chance of victory once American industrial capacity fully mobilized. The final bitter irony emerged when American forces cataloging abandoned German equipment at La Gleize discovered 39 perfectly functional tanks abandoned solely due to fuel exhaustion. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted with bureaucratic precision, fuel required for operational mobility 8,000 gallons. Classification minimal priority. Source local reserve stocks. Estimated time for fuel delivery 4 hours. What proved utterly impossible for German forces? 8,000 gallons to save their best remaining tanks. Rated beneath American notice as a minor logistics request using local reserves, a quantity exceeding Kampfgruppe Peiper's total remaining fuel at peak strength. This was the true meaning of Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld on that cold December morning. Not simply that America possessed more fuel than Germany, but that American abundance operated on such a vast scale that German scarcity became utterly irrelevant to the war's outcome. The war was effectively over the moment American industrial capacity achieved full mobilization, long before Peiper's tanks rolled into Belgium. Germany was measuring an inevitable defeat in individual gallons, while America measured certain victory in infinite oceans. The Tiger tank still sits in La Gleize Museum, its fuel gauge permanently reading empty, an eternal monument to the moment when tactical excellence met logistical reality and lost decisively. Visitors constantly ask the question why such powerful tanks were abandoned by their crews without fighting to destruction. The answer remains brutally simple and unchanging. No fuel. The mathematics were always impossible. Germany never had a chance.